Have you ever looked at your receipt from the grocery store and thought, hang on, since when is bread a luxury item? Or maybe you bought the exact same thing as last month, but suddenly it's 20 cents more. And at the same time, the news says that inflation is falling. So how does that make any sense? In this video, we will look at why your wallet feels under pressure even when the stats say prices are under control. And, little spoiler, it's not just your imagination. So let's start with the basics. Inflation is the rate at which the overall prices for goods and services change over time. Think of it like a giant shopping basket that includes all sorts of things: rent, food, transport, even clothes. Economists track the prices in the basket to see if living costs are rising and if wages or policies need to change. But in reality, inflation is a very personal thing. So we could say that in the euro area, we have millions of different inflation rates, a personal one for each consumer. However, for making policy, we need to agree on a common one, measured as average. But you see, it's an average, so it doesn't reflect how you spend your money.
Well, when we say inflation is at 2%, we actually say the weighted average of price changes is at 2%, right? So this also includes kind of the price changes across all demographics, across all countries. So it's not necessarily the lived experience of a single person. It's more or less a weighted average across all people, in our case in the euro area.
So that means that even when the overall rate is stable, your personal inflation could still be climbing. And it's not just about demographics. Sure, there is a divide between young and old, but it's more than that. Different countries experience inflation differently too. For example, heating costs matter a lot more in Finland than in Spain, where it's the price of air conditioning that people care about. So inflation isn't one size fits all. It's shaped by where you live and how you live, making the real impact much more personal. Say you live in Lisbon or Milan. You're probably spending a large part of your income on rent. Add groceries, transport, a mobile plan, and maybe a couple nights out. And now imagine over the past year, your rent went up 8%, groceries another 5%, but the minimum wage didn't move much. And even if the news says that inflation has now overall dropped, your wallet is still suffering. And this is your lived experience. It might not match what official stats are telling you. But has it always been like this? Maybe you've heard someone say, oh, back in my day, a coffee was 50 cents and rent was a quarter of my salary. So does that mean that things are just actually more expensive now? Let's break it down. In nominal terms, meaning the number on the price tag, yes, things do cost more today. A litre of milk might have been 60 cents in 2000, but now it's €1.20 or more. And rent in European cities has doubled or even tripled since the early 2000s. Inflation is measured by looking at how much the overall prices for goods and services change over time. But it doesn't capture how the prices of specific items like rent or groceries might rise faster than others. And this is why many people feel like prices are increasing more than what the official inflation numbers show. This is called perceived inflation. It's shaped by what we notice most, like food or fuel prices, which we encounter often. Even if the data show inflation is slowing, the public perception may lag behind, especially if day-to-day purchases still feel expensive. After all, how often do you buy a house? Once in a lifetime maybe. But coffee, groceries, transport, these are all daily expenses. When the price of your morning coffee goes from $2.50 to $3.20, you feel it every single day. But when house prices drop 2% in official statistics, you don't feel that relief because you're not buying a house every day. This is why your lived experience can feel somewhat disconnected from what economists are telling you. Some goods, like electronics or clothing, have actually become cheaper in real terms over the past 20 years, and that's thanks to technological advances and global trade. So, no, not everything is more expensive. But the prices for some of the things that matter most to us, like housing, childcare or food, have actually gone up. Let's see what our expert has to say about that.
Well, price changes on the one hand obviously affect us in an economic way because we just have to pay more. But there are also other aspects like emotional or psychological aspects. So we remember how much prices used to be in the past. We compare this also our living standard now. So there are a lot of emotional or psychological aspects to price changes that are not necessarily only covered by the hard kind of numbers going from one price to another.
Another thing to keep in mind is something called substitution bias. Let's say the price of beef goes up. Now, statisticians use surveys to see what people spend their money on. And as it turns out, when beef gets more expensive, people tend to buy more chicken instead. Because of this, when the next inflation numbers come out, beef ends up having less of an impact on overall inflation since it makes up a smaller part of people's spending. And this gives a more accurate picture of how price changes are affecting people's wallets. But here's the thing, you didn't want to substitute. You wanted steak. And if you stick with steak, which is now more expensive, your personal inflation might feel way higher, even if overall inflation seems manageable. And this happens with everything. Premium pasta becomes basic pasta. Brand name becomes generic. Independent coffee shops become chain stores. And even if you do switch to the cheaper option, from steak to chicken or from your favorite bakery to a discount chain, it doesn't always feel like a neutral trade. It can feel like a downgrade, like you've been quietly priced out of the life you used to be able to afford. And that emotional cost isn't captured in the statistics, but it shapes how we experience inflation. It feeds that feeling that things have got worse, even if we're technically spending less.
So the consumer price index is an important measure for economists to assess inflation. But when you have price changes, this also goes hand in hand with kind of spending behavior. You might change your spending behavior. But this change in spending behavior can also affect your well-being, right? And this part from like how this affects your well-being is not reflected in the numbers, right? So think of you have to switch from organic food to processed food, or you switch from an apartment in a city center to a more suburban area, right? These are not neutral choices. I mean, they help you cope with the increase in prices, but they also affect your health, they might affect your time use, they might affect your social connections, and that's why price changes or price increases can feel much more burdensome in your lived experience.
Now let's talk about housing. In most European cities, rent eats up 40 to 60% of the income for people earning minimum wage. And here's what's surprising about it. In some parts of the world, the inflation measure might not always look at what you're actually paying for housing each month. Some inflation measures don't track your real rent or mortgage payments. Instead, they estimate how much your home could be rented out for, basically a guess at its rental value. And this creates a big problem for tenants when their rent goes up. But homeowners don't feel the same increase because they're often paying fixed mortgage rates. In that case, housing inflation might seem moderate overall, even though renters are still getting hit hard.
Indeed, we see that, especially in large cities in Europe, rents are increasing quite fast and in many cases also above the average inflation rate, right? And we know that young people typically rent apartments rather than owning a house. So they're affected by this increase in rental prices. Now, the difference of renting to owning a house is, owning a house, typically you have a mortgage that has a fixed rate. So when interest rates are increased as a response to inflation, you might not necessarily feel immediately through an increase in your rates the costs of this increased inflation. So thereby homeowners can be a bit more shielded from this increase in prices for some time.
So while the news talks about moderate housing inflation, your rent might still be climbing faster than your paycheck. Now let's talk about something that's often neglected, the experience economy. You don't just buy goods, you buy experiences, things like concerts, sporting events, dining out, travel or fitness classes. But here's the problem, experience prices are incredibly sticky. It means that when a restaurant raises prices, they rarely go back down. When concert tickets jump by 10%, well, that's just a new normal. And these experiences can't be easily substituted. You can't just swap a Taylor Swift concert for a local band and say, yeah, they're basically the same thing.
Also, measuring inflation, right? We basically look at a basket of goods and services. And this basket kind of represents the typical spending of a representative household, which sounds very technical, which is basically you take an average person, you look how much they spend, on what they spend it, you create this basket and you track how much this basket costs over time. Now, the composition of this basket kind of is reassessed from time to time by statistical offices, right? But there's still some aspects that maybe are not fully captured or can kind of represent it properly. For example, when you think of young people who spend a lot on so-called experiences, right, which includes travel, streaming, concerts or apps, right? It's much more tricky to assess prices for those spendings or the prices for those experiences, and this can be lacking in official statistics.
That means that inflation stats might not perfectly match how you actually spend your money. especially if your habits have changed. The official basket of goods is updated regularly, so outdated items do get swapped out. Video rentals are out, for example. Now we've got streaming services in there. Still, it takes time for those updates to catch up with how quickly our lives are evolving. Here is something that really gets under people's skin: shrinkflation. For instance, you might pay the same price, but you're getting less of the thing you're buying. Smaller chocolate bars, fewer crisps in the bag, shorter rolls of toilet paper, or less detergent in the bottle. But it's not just the quantity that goes down. The quality of the products may also be getting worse. Now, even though the general inflation indicators do take into account changes in the quality of products and services, it's not always easy to capture those subtle shifts. So sometimes the numbers might miss how a product's value has eroded over time. While these kinds of things are technically included in inflation calculations, they can be tough to track accurately. So even when prices appear stable, your standard of living might still be changing. Here's another layer. Where you live completely changes your inflation experience. And this is largely because of the different consumption habits in different countries. Take clothing, for example. In the warmer climates of Southern Europe, sunglasses and sunscreen are as essential as a good pair of shoes. But up north, where winters are long and harsh, it's all about thermal underwear and scarves and waterproof boots. In Finland, for example, skiing outfits are a staple for many, reflecting the outdoor lifestyle and cold winters. But in a Mediterranean country like Cyprus, these things are practically irrelevant. People in Cyprus care about things like air conditioners, which are a necessity in the summer heat. Food also plays a major role. Olive oil is a basic ingredient in most kitchens in Southern Europe, so if the price of olive oil rises, this has a big impact there. But in the colder northern countries, where dishes rely more on hearty stews and meats, olive oil might not carry the same weight. Instead, what's more important is price hikes on butter or winter vegetables like root crops or cabbage. Even seemingly small differences like the need for extra layers in cold countries versus lighter clothing in warm ones make a big difference in how inflation is felt. It's a fascinating illustration of how inflation doesn't mean the same thing for everyone. It's about what you need depending on lifestyle and climate. This is why inflation feels so different depending on where you are. Let's talk about the other side of the equation: wages. You might hear real wages are growing or purchasing power is stable. But here's what's really happening. Overall wage growth might be keeping pace with overall inflation. But entry-level salaries have stagnated in many European cities. At the same time, the costs that matter most to you, like rent, transport or food, have significantly outpaced wages. So while the overall economy may appear strong on paper, you could be having a tough time with money at the moment. When you're out shopping or paying bills, what you probably notice is how much things cost right now. And that's totally normal. It's what hits your wallet directly. But economists and policymakers tend to look at the bigger picture. Instead of focusing on today's prices, they track how prices are changing over time, whether they're rising quickly, slowly, or moving steadily. That long-term view really matters, especially for central banks, like the European Central Bank. It helps them decide whether to raise or lower interest rates. In mid-2025, for example, the ECB said it was optimistic about inflation. Not because prices had suddenly dropped, but because the overall trend showed that things were calming down. Prices weren't rising as fast anymore, and that's a sign of growing stability. So if you've ever felt like there's a gap between what the experts are saying and what you're feeling at the checkout, that's why. They are looking at the trend, which is based on an agreed common measure of inflation. But you are dealing with the immediate reality, where your personal experience might not line up with those broader trends. So the next time someone says inflation is under control, you'll know it's a bit more complicated. If this helped you make sense of rising costs and financial pressures, hit subscribe. We're connecting more economic dots every week.